Somewhere in the limestone hills above the southern end of the Dead Sea, there is a cave, and in the story you were told, that cave does not exist. You know how this one ends. Everybody knows how this one ends. Fire falls on Sodom. A woman looks back. She becomes a pillar of salt. That is where the sermon stops. That is where the illustrated children's Bible stops, with a little family walking away from the smoke and a caption about not looking back. But Genesis does not stop there. Genesis keeps going for 9 more verses. And those 9 verses are, I think, the most quietly disturbing passage in the entire book. Not because of what they describe, though what they describe is terrible, but because of what the narrator does immediately afterward. Nothing. He does nothing. He tells you what happened in that cave, and then he closes the scene without a single word of judgment. No thunder. No punishment. No, and it was evil in the sight of the Lord. He simply writes down 2 names and moves on to the next chapter and never mentions Lot again as long as the Bible lasts. 2 nations came out of that cave. 2 real nations, with real kings and real armies and real gods, whose inscriptions you can walk into a museum and read this afternoon. And for the next 1,000 years, those 2 nations will be the knife at Israel's side, the ones who hire the prophet to curse them, the ones who put out the right eye of every man in a captured city, the ones the prophets promise will burn exactly the way Sodom burned. That is the story you half know. Here is the part nobody tells you. One of those 2 bloodlines, the one born in the cave, the one with the name that means what it means, walks straight into the throne room of King David. It is in his great-grandmother, and it is in the first chapter of the New Testament, written down, unhidden, in a list of names read aloud in churches every Christmas. And the other bloodline is in there too, quieter, harder to find, sitting in a single verse in the Book of Kings that most people read straight past. So how does that work? How do you get from a cave above a burned plain to the ancestry of a king? When there is a law in Deuteronomy, black and white, that says an Ammonite or a Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, not to the 10th generation, forever, I am going to answer that. But the answer is not where you think it is. It has almost nothing to do with the cave. It has everything to do with the reason that law actually gives, and when you read that reason in the plain text. In the verse itself, it is not the reason you have been told your entire life. It is not close to the reason you have been told. Now, before we go any further, let me tell you how I intend to handle this. The text is frank about what happened in that cave. I am going to be frank about it too, once in the words Genesis uses, without adding a syllable to them. And then I am going to spend our time on what it meant, and what was built on top of it, and what the ground itself has to say, because that is where the buried material actually is. This is not a story to be entertained by. It is a story to be understood. If you want to walk through it with me, subscribe and turn on notifications so the next part of the story finds you when it comes. And leave a comment, tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I always read them. So let us go back to the morning the smoke was still rising. Part 1. The city he begged for. Start with a man running downhill in the dark with 2 angels pulling on his arms. That is Genesis 19 verse 16. Lot is not walking out of Sodom. He is being dragged. The text says he lingered, he hesitated, he stalled, and the messengers physically took hold of his hand and his wife's hand and the hands of his 2 daughters and hauled the 4 of them out of the gate because the Lord was merciful to him. That is the picture. A grown man, a man of standing, being removed from his own house like a child being carried out of a burning building, and the moment they get him clear, they tell him to run for the hills. "Escape to the mountain," they say, "lest you be consumed." And Lot says no. This is the detail I want you to hold on to, because everything that happens in the cave depends on it. In verse 18, Lot argues with the angels. He says he cannot make it to the mountain, that some evil will overtake him and he will die. And then he points at something on the horizon, a small town, close by, sitting at the edge of the plain. "Look," he says, "this city is near to flee unto, and it is a little one. Let me escape to it. Is it not a little one?" He begs for it. He negotiates for it, in the middle of the worst morning of his life, with the sky about to come down. And they grant it. The angel tells him he cannot do anything until Lot arrives there, and because the town was spared for him, its name is changed. It is called Zoar. In Hebrew that means, roughly, small, tiny the little one. The town's name is a permanent record of Lot's argument. Genesis 14 tells us this same place was called Bela before, one of the 5 cities of the plain. One of the 5 that had gone to war a chapter earlier. 4 cities are ash. The 5th is standing because a frightened man said, "Is it not a little one?" The sun rises. Fire falls. His wife looks back. And up on a ridge to the west, Abraham gets up early in the morning and goes to the place where he had stood before the Lord. And he looks out towards Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the plain, and the text says he saw the smoke of the country go up as the smoke of a furnace. That is the last image the chapter gives us from the outside. A man on a hilltop watching a valley burn. So Lot has his town. He fought for it. It was spared for him specifically. He is standing inside the one surviving city in a landscape of ash with his 2 surviving daughters. And then comes verse 30. "And Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar, and he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters." Read that again slowly and you will feel the floor drop out. He leaves. He leaves the town he pleaded for. He goes exactly where the angels told him to go in the first place, up into the mountain, the destination he had insisted would kill him. And Genesis gives one reason, 3 words wide, and then says nothing else about it. He was afraid. Afraid of what? The Bible does not tell you, and I want to be honest with you about that, because the honest answer is one of the most interesting things in the passage. Commentators have filled that silence for 2,500 years, and every filling is a guess. Some say he feared Zoar would burn too, that he had watched 4 cities go in a morning, and did not believe the 5th would last the week. Some say he feared the people of Zoar themselves, the survivors, who now knew whose family the fire had come for. Some say it is simple, unglamorous trauma, a man who has watched a valley incinerate and his wife die on the road behind him, who cannot sit still inside walls anymore, who takes his daughters and goes up into rock where nothing can burn. I lean toward the last one, but I want to be clear that I am leaning, not reporting. The text says he was afraid. The text stops. Now, watch what has happened to this man, because Genesis has been building it for 6 chapters, and this is where it lands. Go back to chapter 13. Abraham and Lot separate, because the land cannot carry both their herds, and Abraham, the older man, the one with the right to choose first, hands the choice to his nephew. And Lot lifts up his eyes and beholds all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord. That is the phrase the text uses, like the garden of God. Lot looked at that valley and saw Eden, and he took it. Then chapter 14, he is living in Sodom. Then chapter 19 verse 1, the angels arrive at evening, and Lot is sitting in the gate of Sodom. That is not a casual detail. In an ancient walled city, the gate is the courthouse and the council chamber and the exchange all at once. Sitting in the gate means standing in the civic life of the place. It means he had arrived. Eden to a city, to a seat at the gate. And now, a hole in the rock with 2 daughters, no wife, no house, no herds, no city, no standing, nothing. The scholar Gordon Wenham, in his commentary on Genesis, puts it about as bluntly as it can be put, that Lot's ruin can hardly be more complete. And here is what I want you to sit with before we go on, because it is the hinge of the whole passage. Genesis does not say he lost everything as a punishment. Genesis does not editorialize at all. It simply moves him, step by step, from the garden of God to a cave, and then it puts him in that cave with 2 young women and a supply of wine, and it stops narrating his choices altogether. From verse 30 onward, Lot does not speak. Not one word ever again in the entire Bible. He is spoken about. He is acted upon. He never speaks. The man who talked his way into sparing a city goes completely silent the moment he enters that cave, and in the dark, his daughters start talking. Part 2. The last people on earth. There is a sentence spoken in that cave that scholars have been arguing about for 2,000 years, and it is only 11 words long in English. The firstborn daughter says to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth." There is not a man in the earth. Now stop on the Hebrew for a moment, because this is one of those places where a single word decides what kind of story you are reading. The word is haaretz, and haaretz can mean the whole earth, the globe, all of it, everything under the sky. It can also mean the land. This land. The region. The territory in front of you. Both are legitimate. Both are ordinary. The Hebrew genuinely carries both, and translators have to pick, and you can watch them picking. The King James and the English Standard Version keep the literal in the earth, which lands on your ear as global. The New International Version renders it around here. The Good News translation goes all the way to in the whole world. So which is it? Did these 2 women believe that every human being on the planet was dead except the 3 of them? That they were the last people alive, a second flood with fire instead of water? Or did they mean something narrower and sadder, that in this valley, in the world they could reach on foot, there was no one left? And here I have to give you the answer scholars actually give, which is more interesting than a clean verdict. Most take it as the daughter's own belief, reported in their own mouths, not as the narrator's statement about the state of the world. Genesis is not telling you humanity is extinct. Genesis is telling you what these 2 women thought in a cave days after the sky opened. And ask yourself what they had actually seen with their own eyes. They had seen a mob at their father's door. Chapter 19, verse 4. The men of the city, both old and young, all the people from every quarter, surrounding the house. They had heard whatever was said on the other side of that door. They had been engaged to be married. Verse 14 tells us, Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and warned them, and to those men he seemed as one that mocked, their husbands to be laughed at him. Then those men burned. They had run out of a city at dawn. They had walked past their mother, who was there and then was not. They had spent time in a town where their father was so frightened he would not stay, and then they had climbed up into the hills and looked back across a plain that Genesis describes, in verse 28, as smoking like a furnace, horizon to horizon. If you have seen that, and you are perhaps 16, perhaps 20, and the only human voice left in your life is an old man who does not speak anymore, how far away does the rest of the world feel? That is not an excuse. I want to be careful. I am not building an excuse. I am telling you that the text gives you their reasoning in their own words, and their reasoning is not desire. It is not appetite. Genesis reports their stated goal in plain language twice, that we may preserve seed of our father. Preserve seed. Keep the line from ending. And to understand why two young women in the second millennium before Christ would treat that as the most urgent thing in the world, more urgent than law, more urgent than horror. You have to understand something about the world they lived in that we have almost entirely lost. In the ancient Near East, a family line that ended was not a sad outcome. It was an annihilation. Your name continued through your children, or it did not continue at all. There was no other mechanism, and the fear of that ending was so severe that the ancient world built formal legal machinery specifically to prevent it. The Bible calls it levirate marriage. Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10, if brothers dwell together and one of them dies without a son, his widow does not marry outside the family. The dead man's brother takes her, and the firstborn son she bears is legally reckoned to the dead brother, that his name be not put out of Israel, that his name be not put out. That is the whole purpose of the law. And this is not a peculiarly Israelite anxiety. We have the Hittite laws, a legal code from Anatolia, from a completely different people in a completely different empire. And paragraph 193 lays out the same chain in almost bureaucratic detail. If a man dies, his brother takes the widow. If the brother then dies, his father takes her. If the father dies too, the father's brother takes her. The line does not stop. The law will not let the line stop. That is the pressure inside that cave. Two women who believe there is no man left, and a code of the world that says a line ending is a kind of death worse than dying. And here is where I have to open something and leave it open, because it is going to matter enormously later. What those two daughters do in that cave is the first appearance in the Bible of a very specific pattern, a woman out of options. In a world where the men who were supposed to protect her line have failed or died or refused, who takes the matter into her own hands by an irregular and scandalous sexual act in order to secure the family's future. The Bible tells that story 3 times. The first time is in this cave, and it is horrifying. The second time is Genesis 38, Tamar and Judah, and it is scandalous and morally tangled, and it ends with Judah saying, out loud, she has been more righteous than I. And the third time it is told, it happens at night on a threshing floor in Bethlehem, and the woman doing it is a Moabite, a descendant of this cave, and the child that comes of it is the grandfather of King David. The same pattern, 3 times, getting cleaner each time and ending in a throne. Hold that, we will come back to it, and when we do, it is going to reframe everything. But first we have to go into the cave, and I am going to do that exactly once, and only in the words the text uses. Part 3. The 2 nights, and the silence. Genesis 19, verse 32. The firstborn says, come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed of our father. And they made their father drink wine that night, and the firstborn went in, and lay with her father, and he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. The next day the firstborn tells the younger what she has done, and says, let us make him drink wine this night also. And they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose, and lay with him, and he perceived, not when she lay down, nor when she arose. That is the account. That is all of it. Genesis does not describe the act, does not linger, does not turn the camera. It gives you the wine, it gives you 2 nights, it gives you 1 repeated clause, and then it gives you the consequence. Thus were both the daughters of Lot, with child by their father. I am not going to add anything to that, and I want to say plainly what it is. Two women, believing themselves at the end of the world, made their father insensible and used his body without his knowledge, on 2 consecutive nights. There is no framing in which that is not a grave wrong done to a man who could not consent, and there is no framing in which those same 2 women are not themselves victims of a fire, of a night at a door, of a father who 1 chapter earlier had offered their bodies to a mob to protect 2 strangers under his roof. Both things are in the text. Neither cancels the other. That is why this passage is so hard, and that is why we are going to spend the rest of our time on what people did with it. Now that repeated clause, he perceived not when she lay down, nor when she arose. Word for word, both nights, verse 33 and verse 35. The Hebrew narrator very rarely repeats himself that exactly, and when he does, it is doing work. What work? It isolates the agency. It says, mechanically, twice, the daughters acted, the father did not know. Whatever else you conclude, the plain text does not put Lot's hands on this. He is the one who drank, twice, which is its own kind of statement, but the sentence structure makes him an object, not an actor. Keep that in your mind, because in a little while I am going to show you an ancient Jewish reading that hangs an entirely different conclusion on 1 single dot of ink above 1 word in that clause. And I am going to show you a book from the 2nd century before Christ that flatly contradicts Genesis and says Lot knew exactly what he was doing. Then come the births, and with the births come the names, and the names are where this stops being a family tragedy and becomes something much larger. The firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab, and Genesis adds a phrase, almost under its breath, the same as the father of the Moabites unto this day. Moab, in Hebrew, the name sits right next to the phrase me'av, from father, from the father. The Greek translators of the Septuagint heard the pun so loudly that they translated the name outright, ekto patros mu, from my father. 200 years before Christ, everyone reading this in Greek knew exactly what the joke was, and the younger, she also bare a son, and called his name Ben-Ammi, son of my kinsman, son of my people. The same is the father of the children of Ammon unto this day. 2 names. One says the unspeakable thing out loud, the other says it sideways, in a whisper, with a word that could just mean family. Now I have to be straight with you about something, because this is exactly the kind of place where a channel like this one could tell you something thrilling and false. Those are not real etymologies. Moab and Ammon were real peoples with real languages, closely related to Hebrew. We will read their own inscriptions later, in their own words, and it is going to be one of the most satisfying things in this whole story. And the actual linguistic origins of the names Moab and Ammon are uncertain. Scholars have proposed several derivations, and there is no consensus. What Genesis is doing here is what the ancient world did constantly, a folk etymology. A pun with a purpose. A Hebrew storyteller hearing a neighbour's national name and cracking it open to make it accuse them. So if you have seen someone online tell you that the Hebrew proves the origin of these nations, no, it does not. It preserves what Israel said about these nations, which is a different and frankly more interesting fact, and now the silence. Genesis reports 2 nights, 2 pregnancies, 2 births, 2 names, and 2 nations. And then it stops. There is no condemnation, no divine reaction, no consequence visited on anyone in the cave. Lot does not repent, is not rebuked, is not struck down. He simply vanishes from the narrative. The next verse of Genesis is chapter 20, verse 1, and Abraham is journeying south, and Lot is gone. Forever, why would a book that is perfectly willing to call things wicked, a book that just incinerated 2 cities for wickedness, go completely silent here? Here is the answer I find most persuasive, and it is a literary one, and once you see it you cannot unsee it. Genesis does not need to render a verdict in verse 38, because Genesis already rendered it in verse 8. Go back. The mob is at the door. Lot goes out to them, shuts the door behind him, and says, Behold now, I have 2 daughters which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them out unto you, and do ye to them as is good in your eyes. He offered them. To a mob to save 2 guests. And now, at the end of the same chapter, in a cave, those same 2 daughters take his body and use it while he is insensible, and the narrator does not lift a finger to comment. That is measure for measure. That is one of the oldest devices in Hebrew narrative, the punishment shaped like the crime, delivered without a word of commentary, because the shape is the commentary. The father who treated his daughters' bodies as things to be handed over has his own body treated as a thing to be used. Genesis does not have to tell you that is terrible. Genesis arranged it so you would feel it. And there is a second pattern running underneath, which scholars have been pointing at for over a century. Go back further to Genesis 9. A cataclysm has destroyed the world. One righteous man survives with his family. He plants a vineyard, drinks the wine, and lies uncovered and insensible in his tent. Something shameful happens involving his son, and when he wakes, a curse falls, and that curse lands on a whole future people, Canaan, who will be Israel's enemies. Noah, then Lot. Cataclysm, sole survivor, wine, insensibility, a sexual shaming, and a nation born under a shadow. The same shape, twice, told the same way. That is not coincidence, and it is not accident. Whoever assembled Genesis knew exactly what rhyme they were building. One last thing before we leave the cave, and it is the thing that tells you how the ancient world itself would have heard this. Some people will tell you that incest was not really prohibited yet, that Leviticus had not been given, that the daughters were not technically breaking a law, and in the canon's own chronology that is narrowly true, Leviticus 18 and 20 come later, at Sinai, generations after this cave. But the ancient Near East had plenty to say without Leviticus. The Code of Hammurabi, Babylon, around 1750 before Christ, centuries before Moses. Paragraph 154. If a man is guilty of incest with his daughter, he is driven out of the place. Exiled, paragraph 157, deals with a son and his mother after the father's death, and the penalty there is that both are burned. The Hittite laws, paragraph 189, are colder still. Relations between a father and his daughter are placed in a category the Hittites called herkel, a word for the gravest class of forbidden pairing, the unspeakable ones, listed alongside a man with his mother and a man with his son. So no, there was no confusion in the ancient world about what this was. Every legal code we can read from that region and that era treats it as among the most serious things a human being can do, which means Genesis is not describing something its first readers would have shrugged at. It is describing something they would have recognized instantly as catastrophic, and then it is refusing, deliberately, to say so. That refusal is a vacuum. And for the next 2,000 years, everybody who read this passage rushed in to fill it. The rabbis filled it one way. A book called Jubilees filled it in the opposite direction. Josephus filled it with sympathy. Philo filled it by denying it happened at all in any literal sense. We are going to hear all of them. But first we need to understand why any of it mattered, because 2 babies were born in that cave, and 2 nations came out of them, and those nations are about to walk into Israel's history carrying knives. Part 4. 2 nations with long memories. 400 years pass. maybe more. And a man named Balak, king of Moab, stands on a hill and looks down at a nation camped on his border. The book of Numbers, chapters 22 through 25. Israel has come up out of Egypt, and they are moving through Transjordan, and Balak is terrified. And what he does is one of the strangest military decisions in the Bible. He does not raise an army. He hires a prophet. He sends for a man named Balaam from far away on the Euphrates and pays him to come and curse Israel. Because Balak has calculated that words aimed at this particular god are more dangerous than spears. The story that follows is famous for the wrong reason. Everyone remembers the donkey that speaks. Almost nobody remembers what it cost. Balaam cannot curse them. Every time he opens his mouth, blessing comes out instead. But the campaign does not end there, and this is the part that matters for us. In chapter 25, Israel camps at a place called Shittim, and the people begin to commit whoredom with the daughters of Moab. And the women call the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and Israel joins itself to Baal-Peor, and a plague breaks out, and 24,000 die. Numbers 31 later ties that seduction back to Balaam's counsel directly. So the record, as Israel kept it, reads like this: Moab could not defeat us with armies or with curses, so Moab got inside us with our own appetites, and it cost us 24,000 people. That is the founding grievance. Everything after it is built on that. Judges chapter 3, Eglon, king of Moab, gathers Ammon and Amalek and takes the city of palm trees, and Israel serves him 18 years. The story of how it ends is one of the most physically gruesome things in scripture. A left-handed man named Ehud, a hidden dagger, a locked upper chamber, and a king so obese the blade disappears into him. That is how much the writer wants you to enjoy the death of a Moabite king. It is not subtle. Judges chapters 10 and 11, the Ammonites this time. 18 years of oppression on the other side of the Jordan, and the deliverer who rises is Jephthah, and the story of Jephthah ends with him making a vow before the battle, and coming home to his daughter running out of the door to meet him. The Ammonite wars produce that. That is the shadow they cast. 1 Samuel 11, Nahash the Ammonite comes up and besieges Jabesh Gilead, and when the city offers to surrender and serve him, Nahash gives them his terms, and his terms are that he will thrust out every right eye in the city, and lay it for a reproach upon all Israel. Not tribute, not slavery, mutilation as a message. This is the atrocity that makes Saul king. The text says the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard it, and his anger was greatly kindled. 2 Samuel 10 through 12, the Great Ammonite War. David sends ambassadors to the new Ammonite king to show kindness after his father's death, and the Ammonites seize the envoys, shave off half their beards, cut their garments off at the hip, and send them home humiliated. The war that follows runs for years, and it is during that war, while the army is out besieging Rabbah of the Ammonites and the king is at home in Jerusalem, that David sees Bathsheba on the roof. The most catastrophic sin in David's life happens in the gap left by a war with the sons of Ammon. 2 Kings 3, Mesha, king of Moab, who was a sheep master and rendered to the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams with the wool, rebels. That name Mesha, I want you to remember. We are going to meet him again in a way you will not expect, and when we do, he is going to speak to us in his own voice. And then the prophets, in a chorus. Isaiah 15 and 16, the burden of Moab. Jeremiah 48, an entire chapter on Moab, and 49 on Ammon. Ezekiel 25. Amos, in chapter 1, condemning Ammon for ripping open the pregnant women of Gilead to enlarge their border, and in chapter 2 condemning Moab for burning the bones of the king of Edom into lime. That is the file. 1,000 years of it. So now ask the question that has been sitting there since the cave. Why does a nation preserve a story like Genesis 19? Why keep that? It is not a flattering story about anybody. Lot is Abraham's nephew. This is family. Why write down, and copy, and canonize, and read aloud in the assembly an account that says your neighbour's founding fathers were conceived in a cave by their own sisters? And the answer, for a long time, was thought to be obvious. Because it is a weapon. The dominant reading in modern scholarship, going back to Hermann Gunkel, carried through Gerhard von Rad, reflected in A. Speiser's Anchor Bible commentary, is that Genesis 19, verses 30 through 38, is an ethnic polemic, a slur with a genealogy attached, a story told by Israelites about the people across the river designed to put a permanent stain on their origin. Von Rad noticed that the text voices no judgment at all, and concluded that it did not need to. The story itself is the judgment. And when you line it up with 1,000 years of Moabite and Ammonite hostility, that reading feels almost self-evident. Of course they told this story about them. Look what those people did to them. But hold on, because there is a verse that does not fit, and it is sitting in the same body of law that we are about to see condemn these nations. And it points the opposite direction so sharply that scholars have argued about it for a century. Deuteronomy chapter 2 verse 9. God speaking to Israel, on the march, with Moab directly ahead of them. Distress not the Moabites, neither contend with them in battle, for I will not give thee of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar unto the children of Lot for a possession. And 10 verses later, verse 19, the same instruction about Ammon. Do not harass them. Do not take their land. I will not give it to you, because I have given it unto the children of Lot for a possession. Because I have given it unto the children of Lot. Read that again. The nations born in that cave have divinely protected territory, not despite Lot, because of Lot. The kinship that Genesis just used to humiliate them is, in Deuteronomy, the exact reason their borders are off limits to Israel's armies. So the picture is already more complicated than the slur. Israel told a story that shamed these peoples, and Israel's own law forbade Israel from taking a single acre of their land on the grounds that they were family. Which brings us to the most quoted verse in this entire subject, and to the thing that almost everyone who quotes it has never actually read. Part 5, the law everybody quotes and nobody finishes. Deuteronomy 23 verse 3. An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter into the congregation of the Lord, even to their 10th generation shall they not enter into the congregation of the Lord forever. There it is, the exclusion, 10 generations, and then the word forever, which cancels the counting and makes it permanent. And if you have ever heard this passage preached, or read it in a study note or seen it on the internet, you have almost certainly been told why. The Ammonites and Moabites are shut out of the assembly of the Lord because of how they were conceived, because of the cave, because their bloodline was corrupt from its first night. The stain of Genesis 19, written into the law of Moses. That is one of the most widespread pieces of misinformation about the Old Testament that I know of. Because Deuteronomy 23 does not stop at verse 3, it keeps going, and the very next verse gives the reason, explicitly, with the word because, and the reason is not the cave. Verse 4. Because they met you not with bread and with water in the way, when ye came forth out of Egypt, and because they hired against thee Balaam the son of Beor of Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse thee. That is it. That is the whole stated rationale. 2 counts. Count 1. Hospitality. When a nation of refugees came up out of slavery, exhausted, on your border you did not bring them bread and water. Count 2, Balaam. You paid a man to curse us. The incest is not mentioned, not alluded to, not hinted at. The law that supposedly enshrines the shame of that cave into Israel's constitution never once refers to it. The charge is a failure of hospitality and an act of hostile magic, both of them things the Moabites and Ammonites did as adults, by choice, 400 years after anyone was born in any cave. Now let that land, because it changes the moral architecture of the entire subject. Deuteronomy does not punish these people for their ancestry. It punishes them for their conduct. The exclusion is earned, not inherited. Which means the sneer of Genesis 19 and the legal exclusion of Deuteronomy 23 are two separate things from two separate places doing two separate jobs. And the popular version has been fusing them together for centuries. And there is a bitter irony inside Count 1 that I do not want you to miss. The charge against Moab and Ammon is that they refused bread and water to strangers in need. What was the sin of Sodom? People will tell you all sorts of things, but the Bible itself, in Ezekiel 16, verse 49, gives an explicit answer. Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters, neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. Sodom's iniquity, according to Ezekiel, she had plenty, and she would not share it with the needy at her gate. And the children born out of Sodom's destruction are condemned in Deuteronomy for exactly the same failure. They would not bring bread and water to people passing by. The cave did not curse them. They grew up to commit their grandparents' sin. That is what the text actually says. And that is a far heavier thing than a bloodline slur, because a bloodline you cannot help. Bread and water you can. Now watch what happens to this law 900 years later, when it stops being a text and becomes a policy. The Jews come back from Babylon. Jerusalem is rubble. The temple is a foundation. And two men, Ezra and Nehemiah, are trying to reconstitute a people who nearly ceased to exist, and their central anxiety is dissolution, not military conquest. Absorption. A remnant so small that in 2 generations of intermarriage there will be nothing left that is recognizably Israel. Ezra 9 and 10 record the crisis. The leaders come to Ezra and tell him the people have not separated themselves, and have taken foreign wives, and Ezra tears his garment and his mantle, and plucks the hair from his head and beard, and sits down astonished. What follows is a mass dissolution of marriages, one of the harshest passages in the Hebrew Bible, and one that the book itself reports without softening. And then Nehemiah 13 verse 1, and this is the moment. On that day they read in the book of Moses in the audience of the people, and therein was found written, that the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever. They read Deuteronomy 23 aloud, in public, and they applied it. And the text says, when they had heard the law, they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. Later in that same chapter, Nehemiah sees Jewish men who have married women of Ashdod, of Ammon, of Moab, and their children who cannot even speak the language of Judah, and he says he contended with them, and cursed them and smote certain of them and plucked off their hair. That is his own account of himself. He is not embarrassed by it. So there is the world, post-exilic Jerusalem, a frightened remnant, a law being enforced with maximum severity, and the Ammonite and the Moabite specifically named as the people who must never come in. And that is the exact historical moment where somebody in Israel wrote, or preserved, or promoted, or read aloud a short, gentle, exquisitely written book about a Moabite woman who came in. Now, is that timing deliberate? Genuinely, honestly, scholars disagree, and I am not going to pretend they do not. One long-standing position, you will find it in the Old Jewish Encyclopedia, and it has been restated by scholars like Victor Matthews, is that the Book of Ruth is a deliberate countertext, a minority voice from the Persian period, arguing through story rather than argument, saying, "Before you enforce that rule to its limit, consider whose great-grandmother she was." The other position pushes back hard. Some scholars have long dated Ruth early on linguistic grounds. The classic argument, going back to S.R. Driver, is that its Hebrew reads pre-exilic, and that the closing genealogy is a later addition. And Tamara Eskenazi and Jacob Wright have argued that Ruth is not a simple attack on Nehemiah at all, but a complementary text that assumes and depends on the very community Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilt. I cannot settle that for you, and neither can anyone else right now. What is not in dispute is the content of the book, and the content is astonishing, because whenever it was written, the Hebrew Bible contains a book named after a Moabite woman, and that book ends with a genealogy, and that genealogy ends with a name. Part 6. The Moabite in the King's Blood. A famine drives a family out of Bethlehem. That is how it starts. A man named Elimelech takes his wife Naomi and 2 sons and goes to live in the country of Moab, the country of all countries, because there is bread there and none at home. And then the men die, all 3 of them, the father, then both sons, and Naomi is left in a foreign country with 2 Moabite daughters-in-law and nothing. You know the scene that follows. Naomi tells them both to go home to their mother's houses. Orpah kisses her and goes, and Ruth clings to her and says the words that get read at weddings by people who have no idea they are listening to a Moabite: "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest. I will lodge, thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." She walks into Bethlehem, and the town notices immediately. And here is a detail worth pausing on, because the book will not let you forget her origin. Ruth is called the Moabitess over and over in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 4. The narrator could have dropped it after the first mention. He does not. Every time she appears at a hinge in the story, the label comes with her. Ruth the Moabitess. The book is not hiding it. The book is insisting on it. She goes out to glean in the fields, the poverty provision in the law, the corners of the harvest left for the poor and the stranger, and she happens onto the field of a man named Boaz. And then comes chapter 3. The threshing floor. Naomi tells her exactly what to do: wash, anoint, put on her best clothes, go down to the floor, but do not make herself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. And when he lies down, mark the place, and go and uncover his feet, and lie down. Now, if you have been paying attention, you have just heard something you recognize. A woman with no legal standing, a man who has drunk and lain down, a night approach in a place where no one is watching, and a family line at stake. The pattern from the cave, the pattern from Tamar and Judah. 3rd time. But watch what Ruth does with it, because this is the most important thing in the book and it is easy to read past. Boaz wakes at midnight, and he is afraid, and he says, "Who art thou?" And she tells him, immediately, out loud, "I am Ruth, thine handmaid." She does not deceive him. She does not disguise herself the way Tamar did with the veil. She does not make him insensible the way the daughters did with the wine. In the moment where every previous version of this story turns on a man not knowing who is with him, Ruth speaks her own name into the dark and asks him to choose. That is the pattern completed and corrected. Same desperation, same stakes, same nighttime scene, and consent placed exactly where it was missing every other time. Boaz goes to the gate. He does it in daylight, in front of witnesses, legally through the proper redeemer. And in chapter 4, verse 10, he says it plainly. He takes Ruth to raise up the name of the dead upon his inheritance, that the name of the dead be not cut off from among his brethren. To raise up the name of the dead. That is levirate language, That is the same fear, a line ending, that drove two women into an unspeakable act in a cave 400 years earlier. Same terror. Utterly different answer. And then the book ends with a genealogy, and the genealogy runs, Boaz begat Obed, and Obed begat Jesse, and Jesse begat David. David, Ruth the Moabitess, is the great-grandmother of the king of Israel. The greatest king in the nation's memory, the man whose throne the Messiah is promised from, is one generation removed from a woman whose people were, by law, permanently excluded from the assembly of the Lord. And nobody hid it. That is what gets me. This is not a secret that scholars dug out. It is the last 5 verses of the book, sitting in the open, in the middle of the Bible, for 2,500 years. And when Matthew opens the New Testament with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham, he does not quietly leave her out either. Matthew chapter 1 verse 5, Boaz begat Obed of Ruth. She is in the list, in the first chapter, in the first paragraph of the New Testament. Now here is the second one, and this one really is buried, and I have never once heard it preached. Turn to 1 Kings chapter 14. Solomon has died, his son takes the throne, and the kingdom is about to split in half, and the writer introduces him with a formula he uses for every king, name, age, length of reign, and mother. Verse 21, and Rehoboam the son of Solomon reigned in Judah. Rehoboam was 41 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city which the Lord did choose out of all the tribes of Israel to put his name there. And his mother's name was Naamah, an Ammonitess. An Ammonitess. And then, and this is the part that tells you it is not an accident, at the end of the same chapter, in verse 31, when the writer closes out Rehoboam's reign, he says it again, and his mother's name was Naamah, an Ammonitess. The chronicler repeats it too, in 2 Chronicles 12, verse 13, 3 times, bracketing his entire reign. The writer is standing on it. Solomon's heir, the man who inherited the temple, the throne, and the covenant line of David, had an Ammonite mother, which means every subsequent king of Judah, every single one, all the way down through Hezekiah and Josiah and into the exile, carried Ammonite blood, the whole royal house, the line the Messiah is promised through. Both branches of that cave came back into the throne room. Moab through Ruth on David's side, Ammon through Naamah on Solomon's, and the Bible records both of them in plain daylight without a word of anxiety about it. So how? How does a legal system that says not to the 10th generation forever produce a royal family descended from both of the excluded nations? The ancient rabbis wrestled with exactly this, and their answer is one of the boldest pieces of legal reasoning in the whole Talmudic tradition, and I want to be very clear about what tier of source we are on now. This is not scripture. This is rabbinic interpretation from many centuries later, and I am telling it to you as that. The Mishnah in Tractate Yevamot, chapter 8, and then the long discussion in the Babylonian Talmud at Yevamot 76 and 77 hangs the entire question on Hebrew grammar. The word in Deuteronomy is Ammoni, masculine, and the ruling is Ammoni, not Ammonite, a male Ammonite, not a female Ammonite, a Moabi, not a Moabite. The exclusion applies to the men, not the women, and the reasoning is not arbitrary, it is tied straight back to the stated charge. What was the accusation? That they did not meet you with bread and water in the way, and who, in that world, went out to meet travellers on a road with provisions? Not the women. The charge describes a public failure by the men of those nations, so the penalty falls on the men of those nations. The Talmud dramatizes this as a public dispute in which the legitimacy of David's own royal line hangs in the balance, and the ruling is delivered and settled. Ammonite, not Ammonitess. Moabite, not Moabitess. Ruth was permitted, David is legitimate. Now, you can find that ruling convenient. Plenty of modern scholars do, and they will tell you it is a retrofit, a legal solution engineered backward from a conclusion nobody was willing to give up. That criticism is fair, and I will not talk you out of it. But I would ask you to notice what it means that they needed it at all. It means the tension was real. It means the rabbis read Deuteronomy 23 and read the book of Ruth and saw clearly that these two texts were pulling in opposite directions. And they refused to solve it by deleting either one. They kept the law. They kept the Moabite. And they built a bridge. And there is one more rabbinic tradition here, and it is strange and beautiful, and I have to flag it very clearly as tradition, not text. Remember the two names. The older daughter called her son Moab, from father, saying the thing out loud. The younger called hers Ben-Ammi, son of my kinsman, saying it discreetly. The rabbis noticed, and in the Midrash on Genesis, and in a discussion in the Talmud they drew a conclusion from it. The younger daughter's modesty was rewarded, which is why, they say, Deuteronomy 2 treats Ammon more gently than Moab. Israel is told not to contend with Moab in battle. But regarding Ammon, the language is even more protective, and then they take it one step further. The elder daughter, who spoke openly, received the greater reward for acting at all, and from her line came Ruth, and from Ruth came David. From the younger came Naamah, and from Naamah came the continuation of Solomon's house. Both of them. Both daughters. Their descendants meeting again, generations later, in one royal family in Jerusalem. That is not in Genesis. Genesis says none of it. That is the rabbis reading the silence and deciding what should have been written in it. But I find it remarkable that when ancient Jewish interpreters looked at those two women in that cave, the verdict they reached was not condemnation. It was that something was owed to them. Part 7. What the stones actually say. In August of 1868, an Anglican missionary named F.A. Klein was travelling east of the Dead Sea, near a place called Diban, when local Bedouin showed him a slab of black basalt lying in the open ground. It was rounded at the top. It was covered, edge to edge, in writing. Klein could not read it. He reported it, and over the following months a scramble began between European powers to buy it, and the pressure of that scramble is what destroyed it. In 1869, with the competing offers escalating, the stone was heated in a fire, doused with cold water, and broken into pieces. But before it broke, a French scholar named Charles Clermont Ganneau had arranged for something to be made, a squeeze. Wet paper pressed onto the surface and peeled away, carrying the shape of every letter with it. That paper impression, and the fragments recovered afterward, are why we have it at all. Roughly 613 letters out of an original 1,000. It sits in the Louvre now. And what it is this: a black stone on which a king of Moab, around 840 years before Christ, wrote down his own account of his own war. His name was Mesha, the same Mesha. 2 Kings chapter 3, Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep master, and he rebelled against the king of Israel. That man. This is his side of it, in his own language, in his own words, carved while he was alive. Take a moment with that, because on a subject this old it almost never happens. He writes that he is Mesha, son of Chemosh, king of Moab. He writes that Omri, king of Israel, oppressed Moab for many days, because Chemosh, the national god of Moab, was angry with his land. He names the towns Dibon, Ataroth, Nebo, Jahaz. He writes that he built the high place for Chemosh. He records his victories the way every ancient king records victories, totally, and with the gods on his side. And then there is a line on that stone that stops you. He is describing what he took from a captured place, and he says he took from there the vessels of Yahweh, and dragged them before Chemosh, the divine name, the name of the God of Israel, cut into stone by an enemy king in the 9th century before Christ, in a language that is not Hebrew, as a boast about looting a sanctuary. Understand what that is. That is an independent, hostile, contemporary witness. Nobody in Israel wrote it. Nobody who liked Israel wrote it. A Moabite king describing his own successful rebellion incidentally confirms there was a kingdom of Israel. There was a dynasty founded by Omri, and the god worshipped there was called Yahweh. The Moabites were real. Their king was real. Their God was real to them. Their war with Israel was real, and both sides wrote it down, and we have both accounts. Now the other side of the river, in 1961, on the Citadel hill in the middle of Amman, the capital of modern Jordan, built directly on top of the ancient city of Rabbath Ammon, a fragment of stone was found with 8 lines of writing on it. It is small, about 26 centimetres by 19. 93 preserved letters. It was published in full in 1968 by a scholar named Siegfried Horn. At the time of its discovery, it was the 3rd longest inscription of its kind found in the southern Levant, behind only the Mesha Stele and the Siloam inscription from Hezekiah's tunnel in Jerusalem. And it is written in Ammonite, the language of the sons of Ammon, and it appears to be a building inscription, and it invokes a god by name. Milcom, 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 5, names Milcom as the abomination of the Ammonites, one of the foreign gods Solomon went after in his old age. Verse 33 repeats it, and here is that god's name, on a stone, on the Ammonite citadel written by Ammonites, roughly 900 years before Christ. Add to that the Ammonite inscription from the Ammon Theatre, and a small bronze bottle from Tel Siran with a full Ammonite text on it, and seals with Ammonite names, and the Iron Age remains at Deban in Moab, and at the Ammon Citadel, city walls, temples, statuary, and you have what the archaeology genuinely establishes. Moab and Ammon were not folklore. They were organised Iron Age kingdoms with their own closely related Semitic languages, their own national gods, their own royal inscriptions, their own cities, sitting exactly where the Bible says they sat, fighting exactly who the Bible says they fought. That is real vindication, and I do not use that word lightly. Now I have to do the other half of the job, which is to tell you what the archaeology does not establish, because this is precisely where this subject goes bad on the internet, and I would rather you hear it straight from me. Start with the cave. Zoar, the little town Lot begged for, is identified with a place called Gor es Safi at the southeastern corner of the Dead Sea. That identification is old and reasonably solid. The town appears as Zoar on the Madaba map. The extraordinary 6th century mosaic map of the Holy Land laid into a church floor in Jordan, which is one of the oldest surviving maps of the region in existence. And in the hills above that site is a place called Deir Ayin Abata. It was investigated in the 1980s and excavated from 1988 to 2003 by an archaeologist named Konstantinos Politis, working with the British Museum. What they found is genuinely wonderful. A Byzantine monastery complex built deliberately around and on top of a natural cave. A basilica, mosaic floors with inscriptions that give dates, one from the year 605 or 606, and another from 691, naming a bishop, a steward, a governor, and even the mosaic layer himself, and architectural fragments carrying Greek inscriptions that invoke Saint Lot. Saint Lot. On the wall, in the hills above Zoar. So there was a working Christian pilgrimage shrine here, venerating this cave as Lot's cave, functioning from the Byzantine period and still going, on that later mosaics evidence, well into the early Islamic period. That is a marvellous fact about the history of devotion. It is not evidence that the events of Genesis 19 happened in that cave. I want to be very precise. What the excavation proves is that by the 5th and 6th centuries after Christ, Christians believed this was the place, and built a monastery to mark it, and came here to pray. That is reception. That is 1,500 years of continuous religious memory, and it is worth something. But nothing at Goreh Safi predates the Hellenistic period. There is no Bronze Age town underneath waiting to be Lot's Zoar. The excavator of a neighbouring site made the point plainly. The Zoar of that 6th century map is not the same thing as any Zoar of the patriarchs. Then there are the cities themselves. For decades the leading candidates for Sodom and Gomorrah were two early Bronze Age sites southeast of the Dead Sea, Bab edh-dhra and Numaira, excavated by Walter Rast and Thomas Schaub. Both were destroyed. Both are in roughly the right region. It was an attractive theory. The problem is chronology, and it is fatal. The destructions are not contemporary with each other. Bab edh-dhra's is dated around 2350 before Christ. Refined analysis put Numaira's around 2600. That is a gap of roughly 250 years. They cannot both have been destroyed in one event, because they were not destroyed in 1 century. And both are far too early for any plausible date for Abraham. Other proposed cities in the group turned out, on excavation, to be mostly cemeteries. Most scholars today decline to make the identification. And then there is the one you have almost certainly seen. In September of 2021, a paper appeared in Scientific Reports, a journal in the Nature portfolio, arguing that a large Middle Bronze Age city north of the Dead Sea called Tul el-hammam had been destroyed by a cosmic airburst, an exploding meteor, comparable to the Tunguska event in Siberia, around 1650 before Christ, and the paper suggested this might stand behind the biblical account of Sodom. It went everywhere, headlines in every country, documentaries. It is still circulating today as though it were established fact. It was retracted on the 24th of April, 2025. The retraction notice is public, and you can read it. It states that concerns were raised about errors in the methodology, the analysis, and the interpretation of the mineralogical and geochemical data, and that the comparison between the site and the Tunguska event was not adequately substantiated, and that, given those concerns, the editors no longer had confidence that the conclusions were reliable. Several of the authors publicly disagreed with the decision. The corresponding author told the science integrity site Retraction Watch that a small but vocal group of scientists had sought to stifle discussion, and that such actions undermine the principles of scientific inquiry. That is his position, and he is entitled to it, and I am reporting it so you have both sides. Separately, other archaeologists working in Jordan had criticised the original work as sensationalism, but the status is the status. The paper stands retracted, and I am telling you that for a specific reason, because the temptation on a subject like this is enormous, to hand you a spectacular scientific confirmation of a Bible story and let you walk away thrilled. It would be very easy. It would also mean that in a year, when you found out on your own, you would never trust anything I told you again. So here is where the ground actually leaves us, honestly. The stones confirm the nations. Emphatically, Moab and Ammon were real kingdoms whose kings wrote their own inscriptions and whose gods we can name. The archaeology of the Dead Sea does not confirm the cave, or the cities, or the fire. There is no material evidence for Genesis 19, and there is a great deal of material evidence that the peoples of Genesis 19 existed. Those are two different claims, and keeping them apart is not a limitation on this story. It is the only thing that makes the rest of it worth listening to. Part 8. Everyone who filled the silence. We come back, at the end, to the thing we started with. Genesis told you what happened in that cave, and then said nothing about it, and for 2,000 years, nobody could leave that alone. I want to walk you through what people did with that silence, in order, because the pattern that emerges is not really about Lot at all. Every generation that filled the gap filled it with themselves. Start about 150 years before Christ, with a Jewish book called Jubilees. It is not scripture in most traditions, and I am flagging that clearly. It is a retelling of Genesis and Exodus, framed as revelation given to Moses, and it has one consistent habit, wherever the Bible is morally ambiguous. Jubilees sands the ambiguity off, and on this passage it does not just fill the silence, it reverses the text. Jubilees chapter 16 says that he and his daughters committed sin upon the earth, such as had not been on the earth since the days of Adam. Not the daughters, he and his daughters. Jubilees makes Lot a guilty party, directly contradicting Genesis's insistence, twice over, that he perceived nothing. And then it goes further. It says a judgment was engraved concerning all his seed on the heavenly tables, to root them out, to leave no seed of the man on earth on the day of condemnation. That is a curse on an entire bloodline, written into heaven, in a book that Genesis gave no warrant for whatsoever, to Josephus, the Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience in the 1st century after Christ. In the Antiquities of the Jews he tells this episode, and his handling could not be more different. He says the daughters thought that all mankind was destroyed, and acted so that the human race might not utterly fail. Sympathy, straight sympathy. Josephus, writing for Romans who would find the story repellent, presents these women as acting to save the species. And then Philo of Alexandria, in the same century, does something else entirely. Philo reads the whole thing as allegory, and dissolves the literal event completely. In his treatise on drunkenness, Lot is a mind turning away from right reason. His wife, turned to a pillar, is convention, and the two daughters are not women at all, they are faculties of the soul. Philo names them deliberation and consent, counsel and assent, the corrupted powers by which a mind talks itself into what it wants and then agrees to it. Understand what Philo has done. He has taken the most morally intolerable passage in Genesis and made it a diagram of self-deception. There is no cave. There is only a man reasoning himself into ruin. Then the rabbis, in the centuries after, and we have already met some of their conclusions. Their instinct is to acquit the daughters and to convict Lot. The daughters, they hold, acted for the sake of heaven. In the Talmudic tractate Nazir, they become the standing example of a startling principle, that a transgression committed with pure intent can, in some circumstances, stand higher than a commandment performed for the wrong reasons. The daughters believed the world had ended. They acted to save it. The rabbis reward them. And Lot they treat harshly. The Midrash accuses him of desire he never admitted to, punning on his own name. And there is one detail I promised you earlier that I have to deliver, because it is a remarkable piece of ancient close reading. In the traditional Hebrew text of Genesis, there is a scribal dot placed above one word in verse 35, in the phrase about the younger daughter, over the word meaning and when she arose. These dots appear in a handful of places in the Torah, and they are ancient. The scribes preserved them for centuries without necessarily agreeing on why, and the rabbis read that dot as a signal. Their conclusion: Lot did not know when she lay down, but he knew when she arose. He knew the first night, what had happened, and he drank again the second night anyway. One mark of ink, an entire reversal of culpability. And I want to be very clear with you, that is interpretation, not text. The plain words of Genesis say he perceived nothing on both nights, but it tells you how carefully these men read, and how badly they wanted the silence to say something. Then the Christian writers, and they mostly moved to defend. Origen, in his homilies on Genesis, places Lot in the middle, excused of lust, because he genuinely did not know, but not innocent either, because his drunkenness opened the door. John Chrysostom, preaching in Antioch, defends everyone. The daughters had an honourable intention, and Lot drank out of grief, not appetite. And Chrysostom tells his congregation flatly not to presume to condemn the just man or his daughters. Augustine locates the fault in the drunkenness. Jerome, who read the Jewish sources more closely, is harder on him. You can see the pressure they were under. The New Testament, in 2 Peter, calls him just Lot, that righteous man. Once your canon has called him righteous, you have a problem in that cave, and the fathers largely solved it by protecting him. And then, in the Reformation, Luther makes the observation that ties the whole thing shut, that through Ruth, Christ himself descends from Lot. And Calvin condemns the act plainly, while granting that the daughters believed they were preserving the human race. Now step outside the tradition entirely for a moment, because the comparison is genuinely illuminating. Islam knows this man. Lut is a prophet in the Quran, and his story is told repeatedly. The warning to the city, the destruction, even the offer of the daughters at the door. The cave is not there. There is no incest episode in the Quran at all. And in classical Islamic thought that is not an oversight, it is doctrine. Prophets are held to be protected from grave sin, and Islamic scholars have historically pointed to this passage as evidence that the biblical text was corrupted, because a prophet of God could not have been part of such a scene. The same man. In one tradition, a passive, ruined, silent figure whose story ends in shame. In the other, an infallible messenger. And the difference between them is not evidence. It is a decision about what a holy book is allowed to say about a holy man. Which brings us, finally, to our own century, where the readings changed again, because the readers changed. Modern scholars, particularly feminist and trauma-informed ones, asked a question nobody had really pressed before. Who is the victim in this passage? Ilona Rashko reads the episode as a projection, the daughters written as initiators in order to displace a desire that properly belongs to the father, so that the story tells itself in a way that protects him. Cheryl Exum reads it as an androcentric fantasy that exhibits a forbidden desire while assigning the blame for it to women. Melissa Jackson takes a different line and reads the daughters as tricksters in the biblical tradition of the powerless who survive by cunning, which is neither pure victimhood nor villainy. And Kiersey Cobb, in a study published in 2021, reads them through trauma theory as survivors enacting, in the only terms left to them, the violation that was done to them first, at a door, by their own father. And while we are here, let me correct something you may have been told. Phyllis Tribble's famous book Texts of Terror is often cited on this passage. Her 4 studies are Hagar, Tamar, the Levite's concubine, and Jephthah's daughter. She addresses the horror of the door in Genesis 19. She does not devote a chapter to the cave. If you have seen that claim, it is not accurate. So look at the whole chorus. Jubilees condemns them and curses their line. Josephus pities them. Philo says it never literally happened. The rabbis reward the daughters and indict the father over a dot of ink. The church fathers defend everyone. Islam removes the story entirely. Modern scholarship asks who was harmed first. Every single one of them is answering a question Genesis refused to answer. And what each of them supplied tells you far more about the world they were standing in than about two women in a cave. That is what a silence does. It does not stay empty. It fills with whoever is looking into it. And I think, though I hold this loosely, that the silence is the point. That Genesis leaves the verdict out, because a verdict would let you close the book. Say it was wicked, and you file it. Say it was justified, and you file it. Leave it blank, and the story stays open, and 3,000 years later people are still standing at the mouth of it arguing. We began with a cave in the hills above a burning plain, two young women who believed the world had ended, and an old man who never spoke again. Out of that came two nations, and 1,000 years of war, and a law that excluded them, and a Moabite woman gleaning barley in a field outside Bethlehem, and a king and a genealogy read aloud every Christmas. None of it was hidden. All of it was written down, kept, copied by people who could have quietly lost a page and never did. Whatever else you believe about this book, that is not the behaviour of a text trying to make itself look good. It kept the cave, it kept the Moabite, it kept the drunkenness of Noah and the deceit of Jacob and the affair on the roof, and it put them all in the ancestry of its own king. The line that runs through Scripture does not run around the terrible things, it runs directly through them. And there is a story that begins exactly where this one ends. Remember Mesha, the king of Moab, on that black stone in the Louvre, boasting about his war. The Bible tells the last hour of that war in 2 Kings chapter 3, and it does not read like anything else in Scripture. Mesha is losing. He is trapped in his own city with the armies of 3 kings outside the wall. And what he does next, on the wall, in full view of both armies, to his own eldest son, ends the battle instantly, and the Hebrew text records the result in a sentence so strange that translators have been arguing about it ever since. That is where we are going next. Until then, take care of yourself and go gently with the hard parts of the book. They were left there on purpose.